Hi, everyone. Good evening. I'd like to welcome everybody to Western Digital. My name is Mark Grace. I'm a senior vice president here with the company. I'm responsible for our commercial devices, from hard drives to SSDs to other flash products. And I'm also an 82 bachelor's and 83 master's graduate of Rensselaer. And both degrees were in industrial management engineering a long time ago. Another member of the executive leadership team here is Dr. Sivaram. And Siva, unfortunately, I can vouch for him with all honesty, is very tied up this evening. He intended to be here with us. But Siva is a member of the Board of Trustees of Rensselaer and would have liked to have joined me here tonight. But Siva asked that I pass along a couple messages on his behalf as well. So this comes from me and Siva. As a member of the Board of Trustees, Siva asked me to mention to you guys and make you aware of a little bit late-breaking news. Joe, I don't know exactly how late-breaking, but Rensselaer will be hosting an event that's titled Coast to Coast West, a celebration of scholarship and a showcase of the new Polytechnic. It's on March 2nd, 19, and it will be at the Rosewood Sandhill in Menlo Park. And extend an invitation to everybody present to consider joining us. I'll be there with Siva for what promises to be a day of exceptional activities, including opportunities to meet transformative members of the Rensselaer faculty, learn more about dynamic research initiatives, and hear from students who will also be in attendance. And lastly, celebrate the importance of scholarship to Rensselaer. As many of you may know, bridging the gap between the cost of a world-class education that I think has served me so well, and I think has served many of us so well, bridging the cost between a world-class Rensselaer education and the financial resources available to current and prospective students is a key pillar of the Rensselaer Capital Campaign, which is entitled Transformative Campaign for Global Change. And the leadership at Rensselaer is committed to increasing student access to a Rensselaer education, not only because it enhances the student experience for all, but also because it's crucial that we expand the pipeline of qualified science, technology, engineering, and math graduates, of course, referred to as STEM graduates, in order to address the great global challenge and opportunity before us. As the new Polytechnic, Rensselaer serves as a great crossroads for collaborations across disciplines, sectors, geographies, cultures, and generations. If we as graduates and beneficiaries are to ensure that Rensselaer graduates our future alumni and alumni, and that they possess the intellectual agility, multicultural sophistication, and global perspective that a 21st century education demands, it's essential that the Rensselaer student experience accurately reflect the diverse and increasingly interconnected world into which they will enter and ultimately lead. So that's why support for scholarship at Rensselaer is so critical. We must continue to attract and retain the best and brightest students from across the nation and around the world, regardless of their socioeconomic backgrounds. And so I wanted to mention that the leadership here at Western Digital launched earlier this year the Western Digital Scholarship Program. Western Digital Scholarships for STEM support access to STEM education for underrepresented and underprivileged students. These scholarships are currently awarded to deserving students in the United States, China, India, Israel, Japan, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Thailand. And we're really excited that this year, and not surprisingly, 36 students who applied and were awarded the Western Digital Scholarships for STEM are attending Rensselaer. So 36. It's an incredible result, and thank you all for that recognition. It's very exciting. Rensselaer really jumped on this, and we are hoping for equal or better results next year. So it's very exciting. So Siva and I both hope that each of you will mark your calendars for March 2nd next year, if you got a PDA or a phone or whatever you got these days, for this upcoming event, and it is to support scholarship at Rensselaer. So consider that, and look forward to seeing you there. So allow me to thank you for joining us for this Rensselaer Silicon Valley Executive Council presentation on the future of blockchain. It's a panel discussion that I'm confident we're all going to find engaging and informative. It's my pleasure to introduce the co-chair of the Rensselaer Silicon Valley Executive Council and also, importantly, the provost of Rensselaer, Dr. Prabhat Hajela. I'll just say a couple words about Dr. Hajela's responsibilities. He's responsible for all the academic portfolios, all of the academic portfolios at Rensselaer. We're honored to have him here, and he works to strengthen the research missions as well at the Institute. He's an aerospace expert. His research interests are in areas related to complex systems analysis and design in the presence of uncertainty. He's published over 275 papers and articles and 4 books in the areas of structural and multidisciplinary optimization. Dr. Hajela, in 2003, served as a congressional fellow, responsible for science and technology policy in the Office of the United States Senator, Mr. Conrad Burns. He's worked on several legislative issues related to aerospace and telecommunications policy, including the development of anti-spam legislation. It didn't cover cell phones. Including the development of this anti-spam legislation, which was signed into law in December 2003. So please join me in welcoming Provost Prabhat Hajela. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Mark, for the very kind introduction. And good evening, everyone. If I look like something that the cat brought in, it's because it is. I left home today on the East Coast at 6 a.m., and thanks to United, I just got in here in the nick of time for this meeting. But I wanted to thank Mark and Siva for making available this wonderful venue at Western Digital for what promises to be a very stimulating conversation this evening. I want to wish and thank Western Digital in general for being a truly outstanding corporate partner for the Institute as well. So again, good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to a panel discussion that will examine the future of the blockchains. This event, as you see here, is sponsored by the Rensselaer Silicon Valley Network Executive Council. And before I introduce the panelists for this evening, let me just take a few moments to tell you a little bit about the Valley Network and what we hope to accomplish through the formation of this entity. The Rensselaer Silicon Valley Network was created actually in the fall of 2017 to develop robust connectivity programs for business development, for greater engagement opportunities for our alumni and alumni, corporations, foundations, parents and potential students connecting with each other, as well as to help us in recruitment of students. The network is committed to hosting innovative events like this one to highlight the Institute's prominence in leading areas of research and education by showcasing Rensselaer leaders and faculty, established and successful alumni and alumni, and rising stars throughout the Silicon Valley and the Bay Area. In this region, there are about 4,200 alumni and alumni who are innovators, they are technology company leaders, private equity and venture capitalists, executives, entrepreneurs, and parents who have a very strong affinity with Rensselaer. Global companies employing Rensselaer alumni and alumni include companies like Western Digital, Applied Materials, Cisco, Cypress Semiconductor, Xilinx, Google, Intel, Juniper Networks, and Salesforce, and many, many more. What we hope is that this network will engage alumni around intellectually stimulating programming, giving you the opportunity to re-engage with your alma mater, to both learn about what is happening at the university, what is new and exciting, but also to elevate the Rensselaer brand in this important geographical area. How will this happen? Well, as brand ambassadors, you can actually help us attract future students from California, but you can also assist those who seek professional opportunities upon graduation through advice, mentoring, and opening up opportunities within your companies and your businesses. In this context, I would like to introduce to you Michelle Tolinchi-Mitchell, who's in the back. Michelle, just stand up. She's our Associate Vice President for Student Transitions. She oversees the Center for Career Counseling and Professional Development. I'd also like to introduce Ms. Jade Felder, who's here with us, and she's leading the ARCH effort in student life. Both Michelle and Jade are interested in boosting the available opportunities for our students and graduates, both in the form of internships as well as full-time opportunities. And I would like you to perhaps reach out to them during the social event this evening to see how you can help. But this network also helps you. It provides for alums with similar or complementary interests to connect with one another, to advance their own career interests, or even connect with faculty and students in Troy for collaboration, consultation, or help in recruiting new talent for your companies. We hope that events like this will bring more of you together, that you will be able to network and connect with each other in ways that you have not done before. We have done a number of such events, and we will publish a calendar of events as we go forward. Now, helping us build this network is an executive council with an exemplary group of executives and influencers in the Silicon Valley. The council is actually led by John Kapek. He's Executive Vice President at Abbott Laboratories. John has 5 degrees from Rensselaer, so he's truly a committed alum. The council already has 9 members and is growing. I don't know, is Deepak Chandani here today? There he is. Deepak is here. He's one of our members. And Adrian Roberts, she didn't make it in time. Okay. We are seeking to expand the council, and our director for individual and principal giving, Joe Strodel, is here. And he would love to chat with you about possibilities. If any of you are interested in joining the executive council, then please contact Joe. So with those introductory remarks, let me move on to the main event for this evening. We have an outstanding panel of guests who will explore the subject of blockchains. Let me ask the panelists to come forward as they are introduced. And let me start with Stephen Ilescu, class of '83. He's responsible for corporate development, DMG Blockchain Solutions. He leads corporate development efforts at this company, a diversified cryptocurrency and blockchain platform company that is focused on mining public blockchains and applying permission blockchain technology to address the fraud and friction that impacts the movement of value through supply chains. He was most recently head of finance at Bitfury, a leading blockchain and cryptocurrency company. Prior to Bitfury, Steve was an equity research analyst at UBS for 9 years, during which time he covered semiconductor companies with an aggregate market cap in excess of $200 billion. He has also worked in the executive marketing and business development roles in the semiconductor and network equipment sectors. Steve received a Bachelor of Science in Computer Engineering from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, with subsequent engineering coursework at Stanford. He received his MBA from the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. Let's welcome Steve to the stage. Next, it's my pleasure to invite up here Jayant Kadambi, class of '85 and '86. Jayant is a serial entrepreneur, technologist, business leader, board member, and an avid tennis player. Most recently, Jayant co-founded and was the CEO of Yumi for 12 years. He's now a board member at Yumi, which is a digital video advertising, media, and software technology company, and Jayant helped lead it from its inception to its current position as a leading global publicly held company. Jayant has a proven record of success that has influenced businesses, driven profitability, inspired talent, and steered client relations. He's co-author of a book on GigaNet Ethernet and holds several domestic and international patents in the field of video, semiconductors, and advertising technology. Jayant has over 20 years of experience in digital media technology, networking, hardware, architectures, and semiconductor. He previously worked as the member of technical staff at the AT&T Bell Labs and vice president of engineering at Netopia. He holds a BS and ME in computers and systems engineering from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. Jayant lives in Palo Alto, California, and another note, he was recognized by Rensselaer as the Entrepreneur of the Year in 2017. Jayant, please. Dr. Oshani Seneverente is the Director of Health Data Research Operations at the Institute for Data Exploration and Applications, or IDEA, at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. At IDEA, Dr. Seneverente leads a project, the goal of which is to predict, detect, and fix initially unforeseen situations in smart contracts that are developed on the blockchain, utilizing novel combinations of machine learning, program analysis, and semantic technologies. Oshani also oversees the research operations for HEALS, targeting the characterization and analysis of computational medical guidelines for chronic diseases such as diabetes. Prior to joining Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, Oshani worked at Oracle, specializing in distributed systems, provenance, and healthcare-related research. She obtained her Ph.D. in computer science from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology under the supervision of Sir Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the semantic web. Oshani. Now, the panel is being moderated by Professor Kurt Brenneman, our Dean of the School of Science. Professor Brenneman is a professor in the Department of Chemistry and Chemical Biology and has been with the university for 29 years. He has served the institute as the head of the department before taking on the role of the dean in 2014. His field of research and scholarship is in the field of computational chemistry and cheminformatics, with a special focus on both computational drug discovery methodology and materials informatic methods. In his position as the Dean of School of Science, Kurt has a special vantage view of new scholarly work in data science and computational methods that are central to the theme of discussion this evening. He is himself a highly published author of many, many articles, and it's my pleasure to turn this panel over to Kurt.
Thank you, Prabhat. I come pre-mic'd. Thank you so much. So, thank you all for coming to this event, and it's exciting to me, and it's exciting to our colleagues here, because we get a chance to really talk about some subjects in the area of blockchain that maybe most folks don't know about or haven't really explored completely in their minds. So I put together a series of questions, a few thoughts, and we're going to stimulate this conversation and get it going. So I'm just going to sit right here, and I was going to ask originally, Oshani, why don't you kind of give us a background as to what is blockchain actually when we refer to it this way, and how does it work?
Sure. So blockchain is nothing more than a simple data structure. It's a linked data structure, and the way that the links are formed is the real novelty in the blockchain. So suppose on the internet you want to send some value. Let's say Alice wants to send some value to Bob, right? So Alice makes a statement saying, I, Alice, with this identified by this particular address, send some value X to Bob, identified by some other value. Now, mind you, this value could be either Bitcoin, it could be some data item, right? Anything that can be tokenized digitally could be sent this way. So once Alice does this broadcast to the network, special group of people or entities called miners, they collect all these transactions, and they might have these very efficient data structures, in the form of something called Merkle trees. So they, essentially they collect all these transactions and they, create a block, right? Now, in the blockchain, you have, these chain of blocks with all these transactions. So the miners get the hash of the previous block, add that hash to whatever the transactions that they collected, create a new hash for that block, and then they solve a cryptographic puzzle. So this solving of the puzzle is really the mining process. And then once they solve the puzzle, they announce to the network, hey, I found the answer to the puzzle. Please add that to the longest, to the blockchain. Now, when they do that, it has to be added to the longest, chain. And mind you, by the time they are doing the mining process, somebody might have already found the longest, the block answer, right? So then all the work that they do might be, in vain. So that's how the blockchain is created, and the type that I described is the public permissionless blockchain that we all hear in the news. Like Bitcoin uses this kind of a blockchain because anybody can join the network. There's no central authority saying that hey, you can join, but you cannot. So anybody can join. Anybody can mine, bitcoins in this network. So that's why it's public and permissionless. And in order to sustain this network, that's why when the miners mine a block, they get some kind of reward. So this kind of feeds in itself. Like in order to have the blockchain, you need to have the miners, and the miners do that because they get a reward, right? That sustains the network. And now there's this other type of blockchain, which are called private and permissioned blockchains. So in those kind of blockchains, it could be a bunch of companies. They create a consortium, and let's say they have a business use case with the supply chain, and although they trust each other as to their identity, they might not trust them wholly. Like they do transactions, but they don't want to go back and let their competitors change a previous transaction they did. So in those cases, you don't have to do the mining process, but still it's another form of blockchain. So that's a very simple answer to what blockchains are.
And I'm so glad you explained that instead of me. You did a great job.
Well, and one of the key elements of blockchain was revealed right there, and that is something, a quote that says, it's best used in scenarios that involve transactions between mutually untrusting partners. Okay, sounds like cash in some ways, but a lot of other things. And so that brings up this next concept. And actually, let me throw this over to Giant. What's the difference really between cryptocurrency and blockchain? I mean, we've certainly heard a lot about Bitcoin, and that's usually associated with blockchain technology. So why don't you run us through kind of the conceptions and misconceptions that are going on here?
As Oshani said, blockchain is a data structure. At the end of the day, it's a structure used to store and or record a piece of data. And so you can use it to record or store anything. Pretty much real estate transactions, and for the cryptocurrency, you can use it to record the transfer of money, or a coin, or digital currency if you don't like the word money. And so cryptocurrency generally gets used in concert with a currency that's being stored on the blockchain. So it's transparent. You can, two untrusting or multiple untrusting people can verify the authenticity of the transaction and without a central authority. So and I found cryptocurrency and blockchain are used interchangeably, and they generally shouldn't be. And in this context, it's usually there is a separate, application is the wrong word, but a separate, I'll use the word application, that is running a currency, just like the US dollar or the pound sterling or whatever. In this case, the most popular one, or the most known one, is Bitcoin, is transferring, it's a mechanism to transfer money or record the amount of money sitting on a blockchain. So they're sort of independent things. And one is a actual currency, and one is a data structure that's recording the currency. So instead of using a central authority or a bank who will start asking questions when you transfer money, if any of you have transferred money internationally, you know you get 400 questions. It takes a while, even inside the country, it takes a while to do, and the government puts all kinds of regulations into it. The idea here is if I use a cryptocurrency running on blockchain, I can record the transaction, it's transparent, anyone can take a look at it, especially if it's public and permissionless, and I don't need a central authority to record and transfer the money. So those are the sort of the differences between the two.
Really brings up some intriguing points that we'll touch on more even later. Steve, we're talking about blockchain Bitcoin mining and sort of how that works. And I know you've been heavily involved in this yourself, and then also the currencies and generating value from them. Would you touch on that for a minute?
Yeah, well, I think we already got some explanation of the mining process. And really, the mining process is a way of assuring that the blockchain has not been altered. It's called immutability mechanism. And that immutability is what generates value and why people have faith that Bitcoin has some intrinsic value. No government can alter the Bitcoin blockchain or these other blockchains. And you think about this whole idea of being able to for governments to have ultimate authority. This is the case where they don't. And ultimately, that is what is generating the value. So with respect to mining, the more miners there are, essentially the more difficult it is for somebody to subvert that blockchain, which in turn makes it more value and increases the utility, which in turn encourages more mining to be done on that blockchain. Now, I know you're asking me, well, then why has Bitcoin dropped 80+% over the course of this year? And clearly, Bitcoin as a commodity itself is very valuable, but inherently what has happened over the past 10 years is we've created what we feel in the long run is this virtuous circle where the mining process itself is ultimately reinforcing the value of the cryptocurrency.
Thank you. And it kind of leads into my next question, which has to do with, at first when blockchains were new, you could do it on a laptop. You could be a miner on a laptop. And you could earn a Bitcoin in doing that. Nowadays, you have to have a server farm with some very large computing capability, GPUs, even ASICs, or possibly field programmable gate arrays, this sort of thing. That's a lot of energy. And so would you speak to that, about the energy use of this, the relative energy use, and this value to society of that use?
Right. So this is actually was a question that was bothering me for a while. I mean, I drive a Prius. I'm environmentally conscious. So the last thing I want to be doing is destroying the planet. So I did a very simple collection of data. And just looking globally, it's very easy to get published data on energy consumption and on GDP. And if you look at the ratio of GDP to energy consumption, it's approximately $4 billion of wealth per gigawatt of energy that is consumed. Now, if you look at the Bitcoin network and what the mining process, what has been generated in terms of revenue and the energy generated, if you look historically, it's been somewhere on the order of $1 to $2 billion per gigawatt. And last year it was higher, this year is lower. But I think this argument that it uses so much energy for just processing a transaction, as we discussed before, the energy consumption has nothing to do with the processing of transactions. And ultimately, the network will scale, so a whole lot more transactions are done. It's about assuring that no government, no entity can alter this network. And when you look at the revenue that miners derive versus what we see in the general economy, the numbers are not that different.
Yeah, and
Thank you.
if I may add
Shani?
something, so I think the global hash power right now is 50 billion hashes per second. So that's 50 billion gigahashes, right? And now the most energy efficient mining hardware that's out there can do 10 billion hashes per second. And if you do the calculation, I think that comes to about 5 gigawatts. And that's more than the energy consumption of state of New York, for example. So that's a lot of electricity. However, because of this wasteful energy consumption, people are thinking of alternative ways of coming to a consensus as to how can we create a block in the blockchain. So there are alternate consensus mechanisms like proof of stake. So instead of saying one CPU gets one vote, you say if you have more stake in the system, you get a vote. So currencies like Ethereum, right now they're still using proof of work, but I think they are planning to move to more proof of stake kind of consensus mechanisms.
It's an interesting point, so we'll delve a little bit more into the meaning of all of that. But one of the things that I found interesting about blockchain in general when I was first learning about its structure and utility was that it really is interesting. There isn't a cryptographic part of it, really. It's just a hashing. A hash code is generated based upon the preceding block of transactions, which is then propagated into the next block. And so therefore, it's interwoven in such a way that it would be very, very hard to hack at that stage anyway. And so that's the part that I think is fascinating, that we spend a lot of time actually making sure that that integrity is there. And we'll talk about such things as how this might be used in transactions that normally require escrows and things like non-trusted transaction of property, going back and looking at who started with some valuable piece of commodity or property and how it was transacted all the way through. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But a very interesting point now that I wanted to get everybody to comment on has to do with this idea of stateless economy or stateless transfer of value. Many will argue that this is a good thing because it provides a mechanism for not having to have certain sorts of federal and other sorts of meddling, as they would say, in the economy. Others could say, well, this is a vector for money laundering or transactions that would feed the dark web. And so I want everybody to comment on that just briefly. Who wants to go first?
So inefficiency in the transfer of anything, a good, money from place A to place B, is sort of ripe for business innovation. So if you take a look at very large businesses now, just pick one Amazon. It's very difficult historically for someone sitting in India to market something far away. And so if you look at supply chains, they tend to have someone who makes a good, then they transfer it to a middleman. The middleman then exports it to somewhere else. Then finally it goes to a retailer, and then they sell it. And the price differential is such that the person who actually makes the good makes pretty close to nothing relative to the price of the good. So the businesses that do well historically have shrunk the supply chain, and Amazon is one. If I make a good, I can go throw it up on eBay or Amazon or wherever, and I can take the bulk of the money. And so The lack of the blockchain can be used in many different ways, theoretically and in practically, where because you don't have a central authority, and a central authority, to come back to my supply chain, is essentially an inefficient controlling authority who takes a large percentage in a business transaction of the money that's being transferred because they're the central authority. It removes that, in theory, by incenting a bunch of people to verify that the transaction is valid, and they will take less money. And so the seller and the buyer of any good can have a more efficient transaction. So the stateless portion of it is just increasing the efficiency of the system. So if I transfer $1 from place A to place B, more of that full value of the dollar is being transferred.
Yeah, I can add something. This whole thing was born out of the cypherpunk movement, where say no to regulations, say no to governments, and then so the creator of the Bitcoin currency, like Satoshi Nakamoto, he holds like millions of Bitcoins, but he's not really cashing out his money. So he's motivated, his or her or they, I don't know the correct pronoun there. So their motivation is probably political, in the sense like say no to central authority, and not really a financial motivation. And I have seen this protester in a repressive regime, like holding a placard saying, "Hi mom, send Bitcoin," and there's a QR code that corresponds to the address of that person. So just imagine like taking a picture of a rally in some repressive regime, and that picture is propagated, and even though their internet is cut off, people can still send that money. They don't have to be connected to the internet to get the money, because only thing you have to do is you have to broadcast the transaction saying, I send X amount of money to this person, and it will still work. So it's that resilient. So I think that is a very powerful feature in blockchain, and so I really value that part of the technology. However, you can attack the system. So we didn't really talk about like 51% mining power. So a government can actually buy up like 51% of the mining power, and then they can control the blockchain to alter records, for example. But then like people will notice that something is going on. Like all of a sudden this government is buying all this mining hardware, so something must be going on. So then people can rally up and they can change the source code. So source code is open source. Again, that's a nice feature of the blockchain technology, because people can see and people can change, people can fork. So all these nice features are there.
So on the money laundering, if you look at Bitcoin is a bearer instrument. That means I have it in my pocket, it's mine. It's not held by anybody else. But cash is a bearer instrument. But guess which one is traceable? Bitcoin. If cash is being used for money laundering, it can't be traced. You have no idea if I give you a dollar bill to Kurt, then and we walk away, there's no way to be able to trace the fact that that I handed him that money. With Bitcoin, there are tools that you can use to actually trace where Bitcoin goes. So the company I work for, and there are others that actually write software to do this. So, and work closely with law enforcement, and we really see that the technology itself actually can assist in terms of being able to trace. Yes, there are types of cryptocurrencies that are truly private, and where it's almost been advertised that, yes, use us for money laundering. Obviously, that's not a good thing, and we are not supportive of that. But it will happen, and just given the frictionless nature of cryptocurrency, it will be used for bad purposes, and it's really up to greater society and law enforcement working together to mitigate that.
I mean, I think the difference is a central authority can't decide what's good or bad. Even a central authority with cash, you can do bad things with cash, money laundering, et cetera. You can do bad things with Bitcoin, but at least you don't have, the theory goes, you don't have a central authority maybe arbitrarily deciding what's good or bad. And then the society or the community can decide whether this is a valid transaction or not, or could record it as you mentioned.
Now, presume society makes a value judgment about certain kinds of transactions that are collective agreements among people, a social norm, let's say. Is there even a way to enforce regulations in this system of transaction? I think Steve mentioned that you can trace it back. You can't necessarily trace it to an individual, though. You trace it to their public key, right? What their public key did.
Yeah, well, that's the hard part, is
Yeah.
to trace it to an actual entity.
Right. So, you want to elaborate a little bit about that, about how you mentioned a little bit about, yes, you can actually trace this a bit more than you could, say, a dollar bill that I'll get from you later.
Well, this is the whole, this just raises the whole issue. Yes, there does need to be a degree of regulation to onboard customers and to make sure that they're not participating in money laundering activities. I think the regulators are still struggling with how to put in place regulation that will articulate that, but that is something that does need to happen.
And if I may add something, so exchanges allow you to exchange Bitcoin or any kind of cryptocurrency to a fiat currency, right? So I think now they're introducing, or maybe already introduced, a bill that Bitcoin or any cryptocurrency is a taxable commodity. So if you do, exchange, you have to declare it as income. So I think, even though, you can buy and sell goods using Bitcoin, if you do convert into a fiat currency, that's under, whatever jurisdiction you're in, right? So you still have the laws governing that particular transaction. You also mentioned about the dark web.
Yes.
Should we elaborate on that? Or?
Yes, let's do that.
Yeah. So, dark web is, untraceable web. So right now, if you search for something like, google.com or amazon.com, it will take you to a website. But on the dark web, you have to use something called onion routing or layered encryption, which means, it's not really available for you to, available through a search engine, but rather, there's this technology called onion routing. So if you take an onion, like you peel one layer, you go to one, the intermediate layer. So like that, in onion routing, you have, let's say you want to send something to somebody, you can, or like you need to reach a particular website, you can encrypt using some intermediate node's private key, and you send that request to that node, and then that node peels it out, and likewise it sends to the exit node, which is called the rendezvous point, and that is where your website is. And there you can actually do transactions. So there was a site like that called the Silk Road, and so through Silk Road, it's an online marketplace where you can buy anything, including illegal drugs, hire for murder. So, that was a bit of a problem, right? Like, you can do all sorts of nefarious things. And that used this innovative combination of layered encryption and Bitcoin. So it was pretty much solid, in terms of technology. However, feds actually got to the person who was running, Silk Road because they made a mistake, like, they kind of revealed their identity. So the feds shut down Silk Road, and they seized, I think 150,000 Bitcoins or whatever, and then the feds actually auctioned off that Bitcoins to people. And so they closed down Silk Road, but then, people started creating similar websites. So law enforcement has been doing this whack-a-mole kind of thing, like, you catch one, site, you shut it down, and then another, site pops up. So it's really, hard for regulation or law enforcement to actually, fix this problem. But it's really fascinating in a technological point of view because, you really can't figure out who's bad or who's good. And in fact, this layered encryption, that was sponsored by the State Department. It was, funded by the State Department because they wanted to find dissidents in repressive regimes. So that was, meant for a good cause, but it was used in very, not so good ways.
As are many things,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So, now, Jayant, we were talking about initial coin offerings before, and maybe you want to tell us a little bit about that, given the Silicon Valley culture about, IPOs and other things like this, or ICO in this case. Those are not going on right now. They're kind of stopped dead in a way. Do you want to elaborate a little bit on that and how that works?
Well, yeah, so the context here is if you're going to start a company doing blockchain, the popular way of raising money was to run the equivalent of an initial public offering, except you raise coins. And so the difference, so I'll give a little bit of context, and hopefully it's not too basic, but normally when you raise money, at least in the Valley, you don't raise huge amounts of money and offer it to the public until you have a product and you've sold it and your company is a certain size and you have sort of there's a body of work that says, okay, this is a real thing. Yeah? And so before that, you are raising money from people who are aware of the risk. I have an idea, give me some money. You may lose it all. Okay, my idea is now a product. The product may not work. Give me some money. You still may lose it all, but the risk is lowered. So there's degrees of risk that are reducing over time. And when you raise money in the public markets in most countries, you have a lot of regulation and checks and balances associated with that. So because there's no central authority for blockchain and in general things associated with blockchain, the concept was, yeah, here I am, I have this great idea, I'm going to print a coin, and I want to raise money. And because of the hype around it, quite a lot of people raised enormous amounts of money, tens of millions of dollars with no product and probably, what, a 200-page document, a 100-page document?
White paper.
Oh, sorry?
A white paper?
Yeah, a white paper with a
Yellow paper.
100-page document that says, this is what I'm going to do. And there were, I don't know, billions and billions of dollars raised in these initial coin offerings where they said, here's a coin. They just made up a coin, like Bitcoin, the company X coin, company Y coin, and everyone who gave money received a coin. And what happened for most of them, I would say, I don't know if most is a proper characterization, the money went into the ether. And the company either burnt through the money or they bought an island in the South Pacific, or the company disappeared and the money disappeared as well. And so the regulatory authorities started to take a look at it. They, especially in the US, they started to differentiate between a token or a coin that is a utility coin versus not a utility coin, and for all these sorts of purposes. And so after a while, people got wise and they said, okay, maybe I won't fund what they call an initial coin offering until there's a real product or certain sets of criteria are met. And I think, as with anything, when there's a rush to something that's new and exciting, there's a little bit of an overzealous sort of interest in making a lot of money quickly, and a lot of people lose money in what goes what most people would call a bubble. So recently, what's happened, I think, is it has been very difficult to raise money by introducing a new coin. To the point where I mentioned to you, I think it's kind of dead temporarily. So what people are trying to do now is say, look, I have a product, I'm selling the product, and they're trying to build a body of work associated before they raise money. And so there's a lot of money raising going on that is traditional Silicon Valley, give me money at this risk level, and I'll try and do an ICO later when I have a product and I have a sales channel.
So this is for both Giant and Steve. So who's funding blockchain startups in general?
Well, if you look at, I mean, in the Valley, you certainly have firms like Andreessen Horowitz that have been, Sequoia, that have been out there in the forefront advocating the technology. I think the best example of a venture-backed protocol layer startup is Dfinity. They're just here at Palo Alto. They look like to be one of the more promising startups. But what I would say also with regards to ICOs is kind of like the internet bubble. You had a lot of money poured in, and obviously you had pets.com that went away, but you also have amazing companies around today like Amazon that came out of all of that. And you know, even companies like Microsoft have reinvented themselves with just as technology has evolved here. In terms of what's gone on with all the ICOs, literally billions of dollars were thrown at this problem. And in terms of really being able to advance the protocols, now you had so much money thrown at this, you're going to have most of them are pets.com or equivalent, but you are going to have some Amazons that come out of this. And with the amount of money, let's say with blockchains like EOS is probably the best known in terms of raising enormous amounts of money. That money is not going to go for islands in the South Pacific. That money is going to go for developers. And you know, as you know, when you think about technology adoption, it's really all about the developer community. And if you can throw a lot of money at developers, you're going to get a developer community. You're going to get some good stuff that came out of all this frenzy.
Thank you. And so we're going to circle back to the cryptocurrency side of this. But before we do that, I wanted to go off and say, okay, other things that are being done with blockchain. We've distinguished the fact that cryptocurrency and blockchain are not equivalent, but what are those other things? So Oshani, you want to talk about that?
So cryptocurrency is the most famous application, and it's, I would say, the most successful blockchain-based application out there right now. However, anything that can be tokenized, anything that can be represented in some digital medium can be used in the blockchain ecosystem. So one thing that I'm pretty much interested in is health data exchange, or like anything to do with healthcare information exchange. So as you may know, in the healthcare space there are lots of regulation. There's HIPAA, for example. So when let's say two different organizations are transferring patient data, if we can have these laws encoded in computer programs, computer interpretable programs, which are called smart contracts in the blockchain space, you can actually make that happen in a very transparent and very secure way, in that no one can deny that this transfer did not happen at a later point. Another interesting area is pharmaceutical drug monitoring. So counterfeit drugs is a big problem in the developing world, especially in the Philippines, for example. They have a lot of drugs that are counterfeit in circulation. So figuring out where these drugs are coming from, who's using what, maybe with combination of IoT devices, it's another area of potential use of blockchain technology. And so I know we talked about cryptocurrency, but actual banking also can use blockchain technologies, because just like how you transfer cryptocurrency, you can transfer real money as a digital token, just like how you'd use online banking to do transactions. And then supply chain management. So I think pharmaceutical drug transfer, that falls under that category. So I know that IBM and Walmart, they have a project to figure out where are the food items that are recalled located. So right now, if a food item is recalled because of E. coli or something, they have to take away everything. But if they can pinpoint where is this lettuce coming from, they can just take the things from that shelf, right? They don't have to take away everything. So there are operational efficiencies and cost-effective solutions that can be implemented through blockchain technologies. I'm pretty sure I'm forgetting many others, but yeah.
I was going to say, you mentioned the term smart contract, and so this is kind of an intriguing feature that piques the interest, that it's associated with, I guess I'd say, conditional performance of a blockchain, and
Right.
so not just as a data storage mechanism, but actually one that does something different
Right.
with different inputs. So why don't you explain that a little
Sure.
bit
So again,
simply for us?
right, yeah, sure. I'll try to make it simple. So just like how the blockchain is just a data structure, smart contract is nothing more than a program, right? So you can write, loops, you can write, conditional, statements, and it'll do whatever you you ask it to do, right? So in fact, you can, say that, oh, I give, this pot of money. You prove that you've done this work, and then I'll give you this money, right? So that actually created this notion of decentralized autonomous organizations. People can have, people can do transfers based on some conditions. So you can do all sorts of interesting things. Now there were some problems with these, DAOs. There were some hacks, and I think $160 million was stolen at that time. But even though there were these problems, it's still a very, very powerful feature in the blockchain ecosystem. And I think apart from the cryptocurrency space, if we are moving to other sectors, it's very important to understand how we can use smart contracts to develop these decentralized applications.
I think real estate is a perfect example of that,
Mm-hmm.
where right now you put money in escrow, and once the escrow agent verifies that the transaction has been signed on both parties, they release so it's a very simple if-then-else clause. And a smart contract is a perfect example of solving that. So the money will get released by the blockchain, or the smart contract, I should say, when the conditions have been satisfied for the title search, or the inspections and all the things related to a real estate transaction. So, and real estate is usually held up as the poster child in many cases for a smart contract, because it's a pretty understandable transaction to all of us. As well, I mean, the whole concept of deed and title and the records is very varied between where you own land. In some countries, trying to find the title is just a disaster relative to other countries. And so blockchain has been held up, and the smart contracts have been held up as a perfect way of having a transparent mechanism that is public as to the title search and the record and the deed and everything else. So you don't have to go into the bowels of some government organization and try and find a yellowed piece of paper from 1922 that's been eaten by cockroaches. Sorry? Yeah, I spoke earlier about supply chain inefficiencies, and one could argue the whole concept of insurance in many cases is an inefficient system, right? So because blockchain will let me verify the title, so the concept of ensuring the fact that I've gotten a wrong title, in theory, should go away.
So, we never said this wasn't going to be disruptive, right? A very disruptive technology to certain markets and things. So,
If I could make one
Yes,
more
please.
comment along the lines of alternative uses. Shani mentioned supply chain, and clearly when you think about supply chain, one of the big issues in global supply chains is fraud. And I saw a statistic that said somewhere on the order of 5% of global GDP is lost to fraud. That's a $4 trillion problem. That's huge. And when you think about being able to utilize the technology to make sure that the truth is the truth, when when products get transferred from one party to another in a supply chain, whether it's in manufacturing or distribution, the ability to reduce that greatly can bring a huge amount of value. So certainly I feel in terms of the one of the non-cryptocurrency applications where it makes the most sense, especially as you can have contained networks of suppliers and have strong companies that are the hub, become a hub that essentially enforce use of a blockchain approach. You can start to realize really big savings over the next several years.
So that's where some of these efficiencies come in from what we've been talking about here. Now, I want everybody to think about and address this idea of public versus private blockchains. And when would that be something that someone would need to have a private blockchain within a firewall, for example, versus outside? And so, Johnny, you want to start, and we'll just go down the row?
Well, I mean, cryptocurrencies are a good example of a necessity for a public blockchain because you want transparency and trust, and anybody verifying or being able to see the record of what happened is an important mechanism. So when you have those characteristics, when you need anybody to have access, and that's important for the transaction, I think a public blockchain is important. And then in cases when those two factors, at least in my opinion, are not true, it becomes debatable on whether you need to make it public or not. Because the other issue is, in order for a public blockchain to work, you need to have, whether it's proof of stake or proof of work, you need to have people doing work. And you need to have a community, and you have to find a way to build a community. So practically getting people to mine is not an easy thing to do, to actually to try and, because they'll only mine if they think the coin that they're getting is worth something.
Yeah.
And so it's a lot, if you don't have that critical mass, you can default to a private blockchain and go spend the time and energy yourself to go do it. And just use that in a mechanism. So that's the way I'd characterize it to start.
Thanks, Steve.
So think of a spectrum of trust. On one side, there's parties that have no trust in each other. And on the other side, you have parties that have some level of trust in each other. And in the case where you have parties that have some level of trust, you could implement technology that allows you to get much higher performance for a lot less cost. And where there's no trust at all, you're going to have you're going to want a public blockchain where you have these enforcement mechanisms like proof of work mining. The other thing also keep in mind, because I've kind of simplistically had this spectrum, so I'll kind of throw it out the window with my next comment, which is technology is not static. And a lot of this money that has been raised over the past year could very well end up creating new technology where we have much fewer compromises to make in terms of transaction throughput and finality, and in terms of how quickly you get confirmed blocks and all these things, and even architectures which we didn't talk about, not being blockchains or these other types of what are called graphs. I mean, technically a blockchain is just a type of graph. And you're going to, over the next few years, really see an evolution where having private or permission blockchains, with the exception, let's say, of the banking industry, which will never utilize a public blockchain, where you might have a large part of the global economy run on public blockchains. They won't be Bitcoin. Bitcoin will have its place. It may be layers above Bitcoin. It'll be other technologies, whatever it is. But just whatever you do, don't think of the world you see it today. You know, this is called the future of blockchain. There's a lot that's going to happen over the next few years.
Lashani, you want to?
Yeah, so I echo the same sentiment regarding the trust aspect. So the public blockchain works pretty well if you need to do transfers or transactions between two mutually untrusting parties, and you need a private permission blockchain if you trust the parties that you are transacting with. Having said that, looking to the future, just imagine when you make these technologies accessible to the masses, right? So in a way, if you think about the public blockchain, it's almost as if you have your credit card transactions out in the open, but without having your name attached to the transaction. So it's your public key, but still it's you. There are ways of figuring out who this individual is by looking at other mechanisms, and de-anonymization can be done with relative ease, actually. So if people think that this is going to be problematic, then there might be a chance that they'll move these kind of transactions to a private permission blockchain. But I guess we are yet to see that. And then in terms of making the blockchain fully anonymized, there are other proposals like, for example, another cryptocurrency called Zcash. It uses this notion called zero knowledge proofs. So without giving your identity in the form of the public key, you say, I'm not giving you anything, but if you give me something to prove, I can prove it. And then that will say that I am who I say I am. It sounds pretty weird, but there's some very interesting mathematical proofs that that makes that cash, that cryptocurrency pretty interesting. So yeah, there are so many different possibilities, but trust is the bigger differentiator between the choice of which blockchain to use.
So one interesting thing that is coming shortly is that there was built into the Bitcoin technology, I guess, a market cap essentially, or the maximum number of Bitcoins that can be created through mining activities and things of this nature. So given the fact that that's true and that amount is going to be reached in the relatively near future, there's going to be a change in the incentive structure for people who are doing this distributed mining being basically computing to make sure that, that we have a consistent and trackable set of transactions encoded, in a sense, but through the hashes. So what's going to happen at that 0 hour when there are no more Bitcoins to be made? So
well, luckily, it's not going to happen overnight. We've started the Bitcoin protocol issues 50 new Bitcoins.
No, it's 12.5.
Well, I meant to say at the beginning, the Bitcoin protocol issued 50 Bitcoins approximately every 10 minutes. Now it's 12.5. In spring of 2020, it will be 6.25. It's approximately every 3.5 to 4 years that it halves. So there's a lot of visibility in how this occurs. So and then what people also don't realize is the mining process, there's really two types of transactions. There's what's called the Coinbase transaction, not the company Coinbase, but there's a technical term called the Coinbase transaction, which is this reward that was 50, now 12.5 Bitcoins. And by the way, you can divide a Bitcoin into 100 million pieces, so you can keep going if you want. And there's also appended to each transaction is a fee that the sender puts on, and that's really determined by the network such that they can get the Bitcoin from the sender to the receiver in a timely manner. So the idea that Satoshi, whether person, he, she, or group, had was, it was the combination of these Coinbase or transactions, or block rewards is another term, and transaction fees together would incentivize the miners to put all this, add this computing power to the network. And the idea was, as the block rewards decline, that the transaction fees will grow on a dollar-denominated basis. So we've seen a lot of gyrations in the fees. They're still relatively small. There was a blip in late 2017, but they've since declined to kind of, let's say, not much higher than the pre-bubble levels. But over time they should increase, and the value of Bitcoin should increase. So even if there is an issue, it's potentially out in time. And I think at least Bitcoin as a core technology for the network has a long time before we get to this issue where there might be some issues as this block reward becomes infinitesimal. By the way, it does go out into the next century, but the numbers become so small in the block reward, they're meaningless. So you're right, essentially by the middle of the next decade, most of the Bitcoins have been mined. So there certainly is a longer term concern, but certainly as think about the mining business as it is right now in Bitcoin, I think it's pretty well understood that this will be a good business for a while, assuming that the price of Bitcoin does recover and continue to grow. Where you have seen where there's all these gyrations is in the Ethereum world, where they've reduced the block reward and they put in these mechanisms. There's a thing called the difficulty bomb, which is supposedly forces them to make this transition to proof of stake and everything else. It just caused a lot of confusion. I'm confused. I think the Ethereum community is confused, and it's being, I think, reflected that the price of Ethereum has declined a lot more than Bitcoin since its peak. So it is important. I think one of the things that if you do have an incentive structure, that it's predictable and people can understand and make long-term investments in it.
Which brings me to a question I wanted to address, tack onto this is there a crypto crash in the future? Are we going to see Bitcoin going to zero or something of that nature?
Well, I mean, I used to be an equity research analyst, so clearly, you know, there's three things I know in life are certain: death, taxes, and 100% of my forecasts will be wrong. So I get that. You know, I certainly believe that the underlying technology has value here. And if Bitcoin does go to zero, it's because something else took over. And in aggregate, this cryptocurrency I see really as the killer app for blockchain for a long time to come. And but I also believe that Bitcoin will recover, and just it's kind of like we've already seen a couple of these cycles in the 10 years of the existence of Bitcoin.
I have a question.
Sure.
On the scaling part, you mentioned earlier that each block is. Oh, thank you. You mentioned earlier that each block is getting difficult to mine because it encapsulates the previous transactions. Now, I'm just looking at an application that's on a supply chain side or financial transactions or anything. We will soon, how can I scale it up if it's getting more and more expensive or more and more expensive to actually log that data? So maybe after X number of transactions, I don't have a block to store that data. So is this a technology that can be scaled up for years or?
Well, the difficulty of mining has nothing to do with what's called the height of the blockchain. That's irrespective. It has to do with this cryptographic puzzle that Oshani mentioned earlier, where you have this number, and all you're trying to do is through this hashing is come up with a number that's smaller than this, what's called a target. It doesn't matter, it's irrespective of that. So that's just how it's done on the public side. And on the private side, or permission side, it's not going to use mining. And there's certainly scalability issues, but they're not but those are just going to be inherent to whatever protocol is developed.
Okay, thank you.
So, Oshani, what are some challenges we might face as blockchain technologies go mainstream? There's no customer support per se, right? Who do you go to, right?
Yeah. So this is a thing that has intrigued me as well, because in my family, like, you know, we lost some private keys, so that means we lost the money. So I was thinking, like, you know, okay, what do we do? Like, you know, if you're a customer of a particular website, you can call up, you know, customer service. Hey, I lost my username, password. What do I do? Like, you know, reset my account and, you know, give me back my money. In blockchain technologies, you can't do that because it's, you know, meant to be decentralized. If you lose your private key, you actually lose your money. In fact, that has happened to many, many people. So the total number of bitcoins to be mined is 21 million. And so far 17 point something million bitcoins have been mined, and out of that, several millions are lost forever because people have either thrown away the hard drives containing their mined bitcoins to, and these are real stories. One guy in the UK has actually forgotten that he had mined bitcoin in his old hard disk, and he had thrown it to the dumpster. And he was going through the dump to find the hard disk, and he couldn't find it, and he lost millions of dollars worth of bitcoins. So but this doesn't have to be, right. This is a digital virtual commodity. So how can we recover this money, especially when it becomes mainstream? People are bound to forget their passwords, right? So how can we make the technology more accessible? And not from the cryptocurrency side, but if you look at application-specific side, there can be situations where you have a smart contract that says, okay, give access to my primary care provider if I'm sick, right? But if I travel somewhere right now, I'm out of my treatment area. If I get sick here, I might have to go to a doctor here. So in such situations, how would I give access to my records to this new doctor? So how do we cater to these break glass kind of scenarios? And I think as blockchain technologies become more mainstream, we might have to think about those things at a research level. And if you might remember, in the early web days in the 90s, we had these great technologies which were very simple, HTTP and HTML, and then people started building websites, and that actually how the web grew to where it is right now. Similarly, with the blockchain technologies, the technology itself is actually pretty simple enough, and then with the introduction of smart contracts, we can build decentralized applications, and people will move beyond cryptocurrency-based applications, and we can see a resurgence of these customer service kind of things, where we might have to learn what are the past behaviors of this individual, how can we cater to this individual if they have a request, and also consensus, how do we utilize computational social choice to actually fix these kind of exceptional situations. So those are some of the interesting things that has intrigued me at a research level. There might not be solutions, but it's still worth looking into it, I think.
Great, and then the next level of research is going to be, what do you think?
Well, what do you mean?
After that.
I don't know. Well, quantum, making smart, making blockchain technologies quantum proof is another interesting research area. I'm not actively doing research on that. So for those of you who are not really familiar with quantum computing, with quantum computers, you can actually break the current cryptographic schemes. SHA-256 can be broken with quantum computing, quantum computers. So making the current blockchain technologies quantum proof is another active research area that we should be looking into. So there are other areas like that. Maybe you probably have some things to add, but yeah.
Well, I guess I was thinking that we'd go through the panel and to sort of to put a cherry on top of this conversation. Talk about, blockchain is an enabling technology. We've seen that, and this is much like the World Wide Web was, as you referred to, when it was first created and then disseminated and then popularized. And actually, it's on which blockchain functions.
Right.
Where do you see the future of blockchain, as in our title here? How is its impact on society going to evolve? And, or maybe that's even the wrong question. So please see if you can summarize those thoughts as we finalize this discussion. And then we'll open for questions. Giant, want to start?
I mean, I'm a big fan of any technology that increases the efficiency of the system. And fundamentally, blockchain does that. It does it for different applications in different ways, but any record keeping, any transaction, any movement of goods, pretty much anything that can be done without a central authority will make it easier, better, faster, cheaper if done properly. So I think you'll see it, with a bunch of growing pains and teething and this and that. I think you'll see it as the basis underlying tech for a lot of applications going forward. That'll just increase the efficiency of the system. I think Steve mentioned one with fraud. I mean, there's just, that's a lot of money, right? So I think one of the issues that we have now is people are spoiled for choice with blockchain. So there's just too many different things that one could do, and people are trying to do everything. So my personal opinion is that you should try a set of things first and then build on it. But it's got a myriad of applications for it, almost anything.
Very good.
So if you want to explain blockchain to your mother or significant other, whoever it may be, I recommend 3 words: automation of trust. And anytime you automate, clearly it's going to have profound impacts for society. But I think the best way to think about how the technology is going to impact society is not in this vacuum, what does blockchain do by itself, but in conjunction with other technologies. And to me, the most important technology suite that we have out there is AI, machine learning, deep learning. And blockchain is clearly going to fit into the technology changes that we see over the next few years. Having all of these technologies come together, and clearly when I've seen and heard comments, where people are talking about this is a unique time in the technology industry where so many profound changes are happening at once. And so I would really look at the impact of blockchain in this larger context of so many technology changes happening at the same time.
Shani?
Yeah, so my concluding remark is that much of the technology in blockchain is not really new. In fact, these things have been done, since the 1970s. And there has been a digital cash, schemes like, invented by somebody called Chaum. However, they didn't take off because, they had very fancy cryptography involved, and they weren't really applicable or accessible to the masses. So one beauty of the blockchain technology I see is that it's very simple. So the real technology behind blockchain is that the hashes and digital signatures, and more importantly, it also combines this innovative incentive engineering so that miners, mine blocks, keep on adding to the blockchain, and then that, creates an ecosystem for other people to use Bitcoins to actually, do transactions. So, and, other nice features like, open source software, that also really adds value to the, blockchain technology. So if you don't look at the hype around blockchain, maybe there's hype because, there's cryptocurrency, people want to, have easy money. In fact, if you start a mining operation every 10 minutes, right now you would get like 12.5 Bitcoins. But if you started like, several years back, you'll get like, 50. Or like, Satoshi got like, millions because he started the genesis, like, so if you don't look at just, making money, but like, think how we can use the technology to other, solutions, like, in cases where we share information between untrusting parties, those are very valid use cases. And I think from research point of also, there are some very interesting things we can, learn from blockchain and also further the research advances on blockchain technologies.
Thank you. So we'd like to open for questions now. We have a roving microphone around here. So, okay, so let's start right here and work our way.
So you mentioned, let's see, the trust and using it to ensure trust, basically. I was wondering if one of the applications could be combating fake news. Like, would you have to associate, like, this is this entity's public key, you know, the news story transferred, and that way we can ensure that, you know, the source is valid and it's been, I mean, does that make any sense?
Panelists?
It has been done before. I forget the name of the project, but they had looked at fake news and how we can say that this is the origin, and other people can verify that this is the origin. So when they are verifying a news story, they get some kind of reward. So you can do that. And in fact, my doctoral research was on something called provenance tracking network, where we can see where something originated. But this was in the context of the web, not in the context of blockchain. So we can apply some semantic technologies to say, like, who said what, at what point in time, where was this thing derived from. So you can imagine having all these kind of information in an immutable ledger so that you can easily verify that this story is valid. But something that's already in use, I am not aware of any, but yeah, it's certainly doable.
Thank you.
So I just want to add, provenance certainly is a killer application for blockchain technology. And where I talked earlier about supply chain of goods, I think of supply chain of data and ensuring when data is passed from one party to another, we know the origin. We can establish that because it was recorded in the blockchain.
There's a difference between, I will say, there's a difference between checking that the source is valid and the origin of the source, and versus the content of the story is valid. So there's sort of two independent things. So just like title search, getting to make sure that the deed or the title or the origin of this is valid is a slightly different problem than checking to see if the contents of the, or in the case of fake news, the contents that were written. So if the source is invalid, you can invalidate it, but then you have to go do some data analysis, machine learning, AI, whatever, semantic, to see if the contents, either through a whole bunch of other historical things or other ways to figure out whether the news itself is fake. So to me, they're two different problems.
So
and one fits blockchain very well.
So actually this conversation fits into my question. Like, if you look at all the wealth created by Facebook and all the Web 2.0, it's digital asset created by the user and monetized by the platform. And that may start changing with the GDPR and other ownership of the data. So in this kind of change of environment, how does blockchain help?
Oh,
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I mean, the idea of a decentralized whatever, decentralized Facebook, has certainly sparked the crypto community a lot, because rather than the users own the data and monetize the data in exchange for these great services, essentially they've sold their soul. They've sold their data to this third party who's now the central authority, and not only have they given up that data, but that data, in certain cases, as we've even seen in the past week, gets hacked. The data is no longer held by the individual. So I think there's this whole idea that potentially that if you can move away from central authorities and users can get back control, I just think the actual implementation of a decentralized, fill in the blank, it's going to be a real challenge. Centralization is much cheaper and more efficient. So to convince people that, no, you don't want Facebook, you want this other thing where you own your own personal information, it's going to be really hard to make that transition. It will happen in certain cases. Certainly healthcare is someplace it should happen.
I mean, so I'll make a comment here. The Facebook is in Google, you are in exchange for a service giving them your data. But Facebook is not really, they are, but the data, what they're selling is your data in aggregate with 1 million other people. So there's another service that is being provided by the centralization. It's not just they're selling your data, they're aggregating the data, massaging it, and then selling it in aggregate. So there's a separate function that needs, even so if you disrupt the supply chain and you give the consumer the ability to sell their own data, that's fine. You can use blockchain to do it, record it. There still needs to be another function, which is in general, there are lots of exceptions to what I'm about to say. Your data individually Zillow is a standing exception to this, and there are other companies that are standing exceptions, not as valuable as 150 million people who want to buy cars. Yeah, and so the aggregation function is important. So independently of blockchain, there has to be a mechanism to aggregate pieces of data that a buyer wants.
And
There's a question back
actually,
there.
there was one point that he raised about GDPR. So with respect to that, there is a clause called right to be forgotten in GDPR. So if you apply that to blockchain, that's going to be a bit of a problem because you have everything in the ledger. Huh? Yeah. So there are these little nuances that you need to consider. Blockchain might not be for everything, right?
Oshani, ties to my question, cascading here. User controlling the privacy or the user owning that data. There was this announcement a few weeks back by Tim Berners-Lee, who you worked with, about Solid, the Solid framework. I wanted to see if you have any thoughts on that where he's asking the community to come together to say, hey, this Facebook kind of model is completely broken and user really needs to have control over their data.
Right.
And does it at all tie to blockchain? That, if you can clarify that.
Yeah, as a person who had actually worked with the underlying technology behind Solid, I can definitely say that it's not really blockchain based. However, if you look at Tim's original vision for the web, he wanted everything to be decentralized. However, because of some of the imperfections in the internet system, namely DNS, the web gave rise to these centralized silos. So Facebook is one of those silos where we go to have connections with our friends. So we essentially give our data to Facebook. So Tim's vision is to create data pods that you own. So we can still have Facebook-like functionality on the browser, but I have my data, you have your data, and we can be still friends on the web, but it will be done through the web browser. And I can say that there are equivalent alternatives in the blockchain space. One notable example is this decentralized blockchain-based social network called Solar. But Tim isn't actively working on blockchain technologies, but his principles are very much in line with the decentralization aspects of the blockchain as well.
Mm-hmm. Question back here.
The panel ended on a up note that everybody thought, pardon me, that there would be a significant promulgation of blockchain in the future. Does anyone fear that the huge amount of money being spent by very large and very powerful organizations to develop patent portfolios relating to blockchain, and in the financial services area, people like Goldman and Bank of America are incredibly active and have huge staffs and huge budgets, and that's just in financial services. So is there any contradiction to your view of promulgation that might be held up or dissuaded by entities' self-interest in establishing strong patent portfolios that limit others' use of blockchain technology in their industries?
Well, I think just
Go ahead.
the thing is, I'll say just from my own experience, the blockchain, the cryptocurrency community is just they're violently open source. Just to emphasize just the overall spirit of the community. So I think there's going to be a lot of projects that have a lot of impact irrespective of these entities creating their own patent portfolios. If you remember before, when I was talking about, I mentioned about the exception of the banks ever utilizing any type of public blockchain, even if it could satisfy their requirements. So I think, you know, the example you raise may be specific to financial services, where a patent portfolio does influence their particular implementation of essentially a very large permission blockchain that replaces the existing financial system. Outside of that, at least I'm personally encouraged that I think at least at the protocol layer, a lot of what is developed will be open source or freely licensed.
The last question, I think.
Thank you. Given that blockchain is a ledger of billions of transactions, a database of those, how does the technology know that I own a Bitcoin if I try to spend one?
Oh. Well, so there's this thing called double spend, attack. You can, have, the same transaction. I mean, you can say, I give this money to this other person, and I can say the same, thing. I don't have that money, but I can again assert that I'm giving that same Bitcoin to another person. But it's not gonna, make an effect because these miners are validating the transaction, right? So, in systems like, Ethereum, you actually have accounts with a balance attached to it, right? You cannot really spend something that you don't really own. So you have these transactions recorded, right? So these money, although they appear to have appeared out of nowhere, out of thin air, they have to be mined by somebody, right? So a miner has to mine that, and they have to actually create a transaction to transfer it to somebody else, right? So all these trail of transactions are already there. So you can actually see whether somebody actually owns a Bitcoin, right? But if your question was more like if I do 2 simultaneous transactions for the same Bitcoin, you cannot do that because then the miners will say this transaction is not valid because it doesn't really match up with what we have in the ledger.
You answered my question.
Okay.
I can write a bad check, but the miners will catch me.
Right, exactly, yeah.
So at this point, join me in thanking our panelists, Jayant, Stephen, Ashani, and for a brilliant discussion, very enlivening, and I'm sure they'll be available for offline discussions following the panel. So thank you all for coming, and I will enjoy mixing with you just now. So thank you very much.